Hello and welcome to Setting the Stage, Episode 1, Tolkien, World War I, and Shelob's Farts. I'm sure many people listening to this podcast are already familiar with the plots of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. The books were already very popular in the D&D community prior to the release of the massively successful movies, and for those who are not familiar with them, I'll give a quick summary. In The Hobbit, Bilbo the Hobbit goes on an adventure with some dwarves and a wizard named Gandalf. They fight goblins in the mountains, spiders and elves in the forest, and slay a dragon to secure its treasure. After claiming the treasure, the heroes must fight to defend it from elves and men, and then they have to team up with the elves and the men against an orc army, and some eagles get involved. It's called the Battle of Five Armies. And in the end, Bilbo and the dwarves succeed, but not without losing about half of their company. During this adventure, Bilbo finds a ring of invisibility that turns out to be very important in the sequel series, The Lord of the Rings. The Lord of the Rings is split into 3 books that tell the story of the good people of Middle-earth, hobbits, dwarves, men, and elves, trying to destroy Bilbo's invisibility ring, which is called the One Ring. And this ring contains the soul of Sauron, the Dark Lord of Middle-earth, and destroying the One Ring will kill the big bad guy. Unfortunately, the ring has a corrupting influence on whoever holds it. Bilbo's nephew Frodo takes the ring, and his journey is to go to the volcanic mountain, Mount Doom, in the evil land of Mordor to destroy it. He's helped by his friends and a bunch of bodyguards along the way. This is called the Fellowship of the Ring. And the Fellowship eventually splits up, and they do a lot of different things to fight Sauron. They fight some undead wraiths, they kill orcs and trolls, they run away from demons, they convince tree people to help them in the war, they fight a bunch of big battles against orcs, they reforge ancient swords, they sneak past guards, and on and on and on. Lots of fun adventures. It's 3 books, so it's got a lot of stuff going on in it. And in the end, they succeed. The One Ring is destroyed, Middle-earth is freed of evil, and everyone lives happily ever after. So with that quick summary out of the way, I'd like to introduce my guest for the day, my best friend, Will.
Hello. I'm William. I've known Isaac for 25 years? Something like that?
Not quite that much, but yeah, close to 25.
Whatever. So I've been the victim of many of his campaigns, and I'm excited to join the first podcast where I know that in many years people will look back and say, not their best work.
Well, yeah.
And so I'm excited to talk about Tolkien today.
Yeah, we started playing in, I want to say 2001? No, it was 2000.
Yeah.
Summer of...
Started playing 2000, but I'd known you a couple years before that, but yeah.
Well, like half a year before that, but...
Yeah, anyway.
Right. Today we're talking about Tolkien. So some people might know this, but not everybody, but Tolkien is like the origin point for Dungeons and Dragons. And by extension, a lot of other role-playing games that were based off of the Dungeons & Dragons role-playing system, or at least inspired by the idea of playing role-playing games like Dungeons & Dragons.
That's right. And really, the to be more specific, the role-playing genre mostly came from Lord of the Rings. Although I guess you can see some influence from The Hobbit, but really Lord of the Rings. Not... for most systems, not The Hobbit because it's a little bit sillier, and not the Silmarillion because it's very boring.
Yes. I mean, you could argue that role-playing games would have still developed. They just would have been different. Like, people were playing, like...
Yeah, I agree with that.
Cops and Robbers,
I think you wouldn't have had...
or Cowboys and Indians or stuff like that. They were playing those games, like, centuries beforehand. So the idea of taking on a role and playing pretend with your friends isn't anything new. And it was just more the specific idea for how role-playing games, as we conceive them now for pen and paper ones, came out of Lord of the Rings.
That's right.
So I wanted to give a little background on Tolkien before we got into the talking about the setting. So Tolkien fought in World War I, and prior to that, he was already like an imaginative little boy. who made up languages with his cousins and was loving to write stories and play pretend and read all sorts of fairy tales and myths and legends and stuff. During World War I, Tolkien didn't cite this specifically as an inspiration for himself, but many soldiers during World War I read a book called Bullfinch's Mythology, which was a translation of Latin and Greek classics to make them more accessible for people who don't know Latin and Greek. So like for non-college educated people would basically be what that was for. Many of the soldiers in the trenches of World War I read the Bullfinch's Mythology, the English. It's an English translation. I know there were other language groups in the war, but so that book provided a lot of inspiration for the other soldiers around Tolkien who started talking about those stories. And Tolkien started thinking, we have these classical myths, and Bullfinch's Mythology also has Norse myths and Near East myths and some Indian myths and stuff like that. And there's also fairy tales, which are largely German and French. But Tolkien was thinking, why don't we have any English stories? And we do sort of have King Arthur, but for those that know the literary history of King Arthur, it's actually a French story that was written about England and Wales and is not really English in origin.
Right. Also, just to clarify, Tolkien, I may quite likely read some relevant materials during the war, but he also was an English literature major at Oxford before the war, or well, actually during the war for part of it. But so that's probably where a lot of his Norse sort of some of the Norse influence and that came from.
Yeah. The Bullfinch was definitely not his initial inspiration. It's just that would have been priming other people around him during the war to start talking about those stories. And
because they were bored out of their minds.
Yes. So like you're sitting there for 2 months until someone tells you to go die by jumping over the trench. So you read stories and you talk to them with your friends.
Yeah.
As much as we're doing now.
You didn't even figure out rotations until later in the war, but we don't need to get into that.
Right. So Tolkien, when he served, actually was part of those rotations, and technically a casualty of the war. He got trench fever and was sent back home. So he actually only served on the front and in those rotations for 4 months. At least I think it was rotations at that point. Maybe you know better than I do, Will.
I don't know. They didn't have rotations globally because they couldn't get the troops there.
From what I read, there were rotations. So he served in, it was the Somme, is that right? That was the battle he was part of?
Yeah,
cool.
Served in the Somme and had a fairly undistinguished career.
Yes. So he went back to Oxford and still loved stories and languages and English. So he wanted to create a English myth, and that's where The Hobbit came. So he wrote The Hobbit and formed a literary group at Oxford. Well, it was part of forming one. I wouldn't say it was just him. Called the Inklings, where there are many more well-known English authors, but the two that are more internationally known for the Inkling group is Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, who wrote the Chronicles of Narnia, among other great books that I like a lot. But C.S. Lewis is also well known for being super, super Christian, and all of his writings are Christian.
Yeah, I'm actually, I'm not as big a fan of C.S. Lewis's song, but he's still obviously very good.
Yes, I would. I mean, if you want to read the Screw Tape letters, it's good. Very Christian, but still very good. I like it.
Yeah, I mean, I think like the Chronicles of Narnia is still good, except for like the last book is kind of weird. But like he's still like a top 5 English fictional author of the 20th century. He's still good.
Yeah, definitely. So then he wrote The Hobbit, big success. Then he wrote The Silmarillion. The Inklings and his editor convinced him that it was unpublishable. So then he wrote The Lord of the Rings and became internationally famous. And then a couple years later, he died.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah, I mean, depending on how you frame a couple of years, I think it was 20 years, but...
Yeah, it was about 20 years.
So, what happened after that is war games had existed for a long time. I mean, war games have also existed basically as long as children have been playing with little figurines that represent soldiers. And they got more, I would say, standardized after World War I, where people started wanting to represent these huge battles where there were tons and tons of troops. So people had all of these games for World War I and World War II. And some of them were like, well, let's make something for a earlier battle. So there was a game called Chainmail that was used to represent pre-gunpowder combat for tons of units. So like you have one little soldier guy on the board, but he actually represents more like 100 soldiers or something like that.
Right.
And the creators for Chainmail, who our beloved Guy Jacks was one of them, also came up with some extra rules for playing Lord of the Rings using chainmail characters. So you have, like, one person would play the Fellowship, and the other person on the other side would play the Orcs of Moria. So the Fellowship dude just has 9 little units, and he's supposed to keep 8 of them alive, because Gandalf dies in that battle. And then the Orc of Moria guy has, 200 orcs and a Balrog. And maybe 2 trolls or something. I don't know. So then that way they can have a little battle where the orcs are trying to stop the 8 people from escaping the mines. And the guy playing the Fellowship is trying to get the 8 people to get through the mines. And I'm saying guy because this was almost an exclusively male hobby until maybe the 90s.
Pretty recently, yeah.
Yeah. Still kind of is, unfortunately. But yeah, that's where we're at.
Yeah.
So that then developed into Dungeons and Dragons, where instead of just having it be a set battle, instead it's a series of battles where you get to choose and develop your own character instead of it just being Gandalf has a sword and can cast light or whatever. He doesn't actually cast that much magic. Yeah, so that's where Lord of the Rings and Tolkien's work turns into D&D, and why we chose this as a starting point, because, first podcast, let's have it be about the quasi first campaign setting for playing Dungeons and Dragons in.
Right. So so the question with Tolkien as a campaign setting is what part of Tolkien are you using? Because obviously we mentioned The Hobbit, but there's Lord of the Rings, but also there's with the Silmarillion, you have a lot of areas you can sort of pick.
Mm-hmm.
And
right, so Tolkien split the history of his world into 4, well, depending on how you count it. He said 7 ages because he thought he would eventually write enough stuff to take it from his initial Genesis kind of myths into something that would be like elves are living secretly among modern humans or something like that. And he also stopped doing that writing because he's Christian, and he found that it started to get a lot darker the closer he got to modern history. So he decided to not write sequels to Lord of the Rings. So I said 7 ages, but more realistically, he only wrote 3 ages. And something that there you can sort of, there's a little bit of in his writings in the Silmarillion about the 4th age, and also a little bit about the before the First Age. So the First Age is really the ages are mostly separated by the defeat of a Dark Lord. So for those that are familiar with the Lord of the Rings story, there's this evil guy called Sauron, but he had a master called Morgoth. Morgoth is one of the Valar, who are basically gods, or maybe in the Christian version of the story, because there is a god called Eru. The Valar are more like archangels. So Morgoth is the evil archangel, so effectively Lucifer or Satan. So Morgoth is trying to corrupt creation because he's jealous of God's power to create. And that leads to all the other Valar not liking him and eventually defeating him and exiling him at the end of the first age. Then we get to the second age, where Morgoth has a attendant, a normal angel being, but also very strong, called Sauron. And Sauron realizes that Morgoth was trying to use like direct force, so Sauron starts trying to trick people, and he makes a bunch of rings to try and control the different races of Middle-earth, except hobbits, because I don't know why.
I assume he just didn't care about hobbits that much.
Yeah, Tolkien never wrote like where hobbits came from in the story. So like, elves are the first creation, and men are the second, and dwarves were created by accident, and orcs were made by Morgoth corrupting elves. But hobbits are just sort of there.
I mean, hobbit's gonna hobbit, right?
Yeah. Then all the other monsters were made by Morgoth because he likes making evil monsters.
I mean, that's his thing, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and that like plants and animals and ents were made by the other Valar. I'm getting a little off topic here, but okay. So second age, he makes all the rings. The elves discover that the rings are corrupted, so they don't wear the 3 that were made for them. And then Sauron uses one ring to control the humans. To corrupt the dwarves. He's not able to fully corrupt the dwarves because they're too tough. But he's able to make them sort of neutral. He turns them into Switzerland, where they're just hiding in their mountains and holding onto their gold. We're starting to get
things.
Yeah, we're getting into the World War I parallels here. So the dwarves are basically Swiss.
Sort of.
Sauron's eventually defeated by elves and men working together. And they cut off the ring, but because he's a powerful angel, he doesn't actually die. So then Lord of the Rings is about the end of the third age, where Sauron comes back, and then they destroy the ring, which basically kills Sauron for good. And then everyone is happy in the fourth age, and everything's fine forever and ever afterwards.
Because Tolkien, as you said, didn't get to writing more books.
Yeah, so from what I read, he started writing a sequel to the Return of the King about Aragorn, wrong fantasy series, about Aragorn's son or grandson or something. But he ran into this issue where, like, Sauron's dead, so he needs a new villain, and the villain inevitably has to be just a normal human. You know, went from like archangel to angel, and now just a normal human. Right. And he felt like that was just sort of too depressing of a story of just people hurting each other, instead of it being some sort of, you know, evil demonic force that was causing suffering in people's lives. So again, like he was too Christian to tell a story like that. It just depressed him, and he thought it was like not the kind of heroic fantasy that he wanted to bring through out with his writing.
Yeah.
And remember, he was trying to write like English mythology, where like people were attracted to this world of like, you know, the black and white and a happy ending.
Yeah. I mean, you wanted to write sort of I mean, not that all of the old fantasy is all black and white. It's sort of not, but it's clear what he was drawn to. Mm-hmm. Or anyway.
So the question is, when do you set your story? Because you've got first age, second age, third age, and fourth age. Now, I said there was stuff before the first age, but that's basically just gods and angels hanging out, making the world. So I wouldn't say there's anything for like players to do during that time period.
Well, unless you're just saying in like Dungeon World or something, then it can be can make you can like.
Well, I mean, yeah, you could play like Dawn of Worlds from that time point with like Middle Earth, where like, okay, you get to be this one of the Valar, and I'll be Morgoth, but then why are you bothering to do like Middle Earth at all?
Lord of the Rings.
Yeah,
sure, that makes sense. Yeah.
So the time period, I mean, there's definitely tons of choices there, and it depends on kind of the scale you want to do. Like the First Age, everyone's running around as like level 20 characters or something.
Yeah.
And the Third Age, I believe there's been a few comparisons between that, like the power level for what like someone like Aragorn is, and he's basically like level 5 or 6.
Right, and Gandalf, who's probably the most powerful, is like from a different age, basically.
Yeah, he's from the Second Age, I think. Yeah, he is. That's right.
Almost all the most powerful people are basically from the previous age.
Yeah, and even then, he's like not actually that powerful a wizard. Like, what does he cast? Like light and shield.
Yeah, I mean, you take out a Balrog, but
yeah, but does he do it with magic or with a big sword?
Fair enough. Maybe he's just like a paladin.
Yeah, he's much more like a fighter class, honestly. Like he's usually like, I mean, in the movies he's using like a stick and a sword, so he's like fighting with 2 weapons. I think he smites the Balrog, so sure, he could be a paladin. And he casts light, shield, and the pine cones he like sets on fire to throw at the orcs in The Hobbit.
Yeah.
It's probably more of a druid spell, but like his spell casting is like first and second level spells for how D&D sets the power level. So that means he's like a 4th level caster at best. At least for what we see of him.
Yeah.
So this is also a difference in power level between the angels. So Gandalf and Sauron are both like the same level of angel called a Maiar. But obviously vastly different in what they're capable of doing.
Yeah. So I mean, I tend to think super high level D&D doesn't work that well. So I think you want to go like, I think your best bet's probably going to be, at least as a player, I also want to say 3rd or even 4th age is kind of where you, at least for starting of a campaign, is where you're going to want to set yourself. The first age is just kind of taking out Balrogs left and right.
Yeah, I'd agree. The first age, it feels like it's hard to pick something that would work. I mean, in other parts of this is that you're somewhat restricted by, okay, so you do the first stage. Are you going to play like the named characters in it? Like there's Feanor, and like he has 2 friends that help him try to steal one of the Silmarils, I think is one of the stories that happens. So they're trying to steal like this shiny gem thing that's made of the sort of the sun's light, so it's super powerful. I'm oversimplifying. And they get it, but his 2 friends die in the process. So like that's an adventure. You could design an adventure where they're trying to get all 3 back during the first age, but inevitably you lead to something that is no longer Lord of the Rings because you've changed what happened.
I mean, it's fine. I just don't know. I think it'd be a little weird to play in the first stage.
Yeah, especially since like I usually feel like when you're picking a campaign setting that's established like Lord of the Rings with like a specific story that occurs in the Third Age, you usually want to be as close to that as possible.
I feel like you want that. Like that's like fundamentally, like I understand that like those people have read like
yeah,
like, that is.
Yeah, like when I get into Lord of the Rings, I don't want to play like all these background characters from the Silmarillion. I want to play something where I get to, like, I don't know, like Aragorn assigns me a quest after, because he's now King of Gondor.
I was thinking a good period would be like an Aragorn quest before the Lord of the Rings, the Fellowship or something.
Yeah, you could do that too. Like he's a ranger for what, like 60 years or something before he joins up with the Fellowship. Right. So you could even have someone play Aragorn during that period and as like a first level ranger, and there's nothing wrong with it. So yeah, that's a good time period, which is basically set between The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. Which gets me to the thing I wanted to bring up. That's basically what the Shadow of Mordor games are about. You play a ranger, and the video games are set between The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. So, yeah, it's a great setting. It's a great choice for a time setting, and it's the one that was used for a official product that was created. What would you want to do as a player in that setting?
I mean, well, not really about subtlety. To me, it's like maybe you're doing something to try and like make Mordor a little weaker, even though obviously you're not going to stop it. So like you I don't know, maybe you're trying to stop like some of the Easterlings from defecting or something. I don't know. Something like that. Or you're trying to get a little sooner.
I mean, during that period, there's like orcs that are attacking Gondor like every couple years or something.
Right, so maybe you're doing something for those wars. That feels to me like the natural sort of trying to set up the non Sauron forces in a better position for when the Fellowship starts. Sort of. That's sort of what I would want to do. Like, I guess this is a little bit. To me, it's like if you're gonna play The Lord of the Rings, you have to play The Lord of the Rings, and like that sort of fits it. You can also just like do the some sort of fellowship type thing. Although maybe you start the campaign like after The Hobbit, and you sort of get to The Lord of the Rings, and you're like you have like a different fellowship or something.
Yeah. So instead of Aragorn and Boromir show up, it's your guy, and the other players show up, and they become Gimli and Boromir and Aragorn.
Right.
And Legolas. Now, I kind of felt like the actually role-playing the Lord of the Rings story is a bit difficult if you do that angle for it.
Yeah, I mean, it is.
I mean, just following the plot, for one thing, it's like, okay, everyone sort of knows what's going to happen.
No, I think you just have to, it's only interesting if, like, the plot changes, like, you choose a different tact.
Well, I mean, and the route that they take does change. Like, initially they're going to go by Isengard, and then they can't go that way. So then they try going over the mountains, and they can't go that way. So then they go through the mines. Like, it's their third choice at that point.
Right. Well, maybe you do get over the mountains. Like, that's, I don't know.
And, you can take other ways like that. Maybe they stay in Lothlorien and try and protect the ring there. So then they have to deal with, like, an orc attack or something. Like, there's all sorts of choices you could make besides just destroying the ring. But what I meant isn't like that the actual story removes player agency because the players can make different choices. I was going to say that the ring removes player agency. Like, its whole concept is that it's turning you into an agent of Sauron.
Right. So you kind of have to just destroy it, fundamentally.
Yeah, well, but like whichever player becomes the ring bearer has to basically role play and deal with their losing agency for their character.
I think it works better if the ring bearer is an NPC, to be honest with you.
Yeah. I just feel like that almost ends up being less interesting, but I guess it's possible. You definitely have to have Frodo not leave the Fellowship if that's the angle you're going for, I think.
I mean, you can't really long-term split the party. Like, it doesn't work.
Well, I mean,
Like,
so if you imagine the party is Aragorn, Gimli, and Legolas, then
yeah.
splitting the party then works fine because they have a different objective that they decide to go for.
But how are you actually playing the session out is my question. Like,
well, and that's the thing. Like, okay, so Merry and Pippin get kidnapped, and Frodo and Sam go off in their own direction. What does the party choose to do? Well, in the story, they go after Merry and Pippin, but the PCs could easily choose to go after Sam and Frodo. And then that's what happens, and the DM rolls with it, and you have
or they just, I don't know, go straight to Gondor or something.
Yeah.
In some ways, I think it's more interesting if the party doesn't have the ring, because I think you're right. It's sort of
like the Hobbit. I feel like you could work pretty well as just like you're not taking away player agency by doing the ring. You're just like going and getting some treasure and killing a dragon. It's cool.
I mean, look, the Hobbit does. You just have to play the Hobbit, I think, on its own terms. The ring's just literally an invisibility ring.
Yeah. I mean, it doesn't do anything special, and it's also possible that like you might not even find it.
Yeah.
Like I think for what happens to Bilbo, he like falls down a hole.
Well, he's running away from the goblins, so like, and they get in the cave. Like the whole thing, like you probably wouldn't find the ring.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. That's like an extra room that like realistically you don't end up there. Like he gets knocked unconscious and ends up there. It almost looks like the DM said, "Oh, okay, so they have to leave you, but I don't want to kill your character, so you end up in a hole and you find an invisibility ring so you could sneak past all the goblins and get out of the mountains." Okay, yeah, that works. Okay, we're good. It's like, I mean, you tell that story, it's like someone's gonna be like, "Oh yeah, the DM just didn't want to kill you, so they gave you a magic ring, man."
Right. And then he retcons the DM retcons the ring into being important, which is actually what Tolkien did, basically.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so I feel like doing something in between is probably the best idea, because then you can still have those touch points of Aragorn and Gandalf, Legolas, Gimli. So all of these characters that we like can still be present in the story, and the players can even play them, but you don't have to deal with the ring. But you could still have an important object like that because there are other rings.
Right.
So the Dwarven rings are easy examples. There's 7 of those. Tolkien said 4 of them were destroyed by dragons, so you're left with 3 if you want to keep it canon for those.
Sure.
But still, like that's 3 cool stories you can have. The other would be the 9 rings for the human kings.
Right.
It's never said that the wraiths are still wearing them. Basically, they could have been corrupted by the rings and then had them taken away, and Sauron could be like trying to create 9 more or something.
Or we should just keep handing the rings out, like once it's sufficiently corrupted. I don't know.
Yeah, like okay, so it takes like 2,000 years to turn someone into a ring wraith. So, he took them off of those guys, put them onto 9 other guys, and they're about to turn into ring wraiths, and you need to, stop them before they fully convert, so that there's not the 18 instead of the 9 that are hunting the Fellowship. Right. And so, that's a campaign idea right there. And Gandalf also mentions in The Hobbit that there are many rings. So he notices that Bilbo has this ring that turns him invisible, but he doesn't immediately think, "Oh, that must be the one ring, because that one turns you invisible." So that'd
be a fun DM idea. You play you have it, but you give them like an invisibility ring. Yeah. They think it's like the one ring. You just like never tell the players that anything like that. And it just turns out like Gandalf shows up and he's like, "I don't think this is anything." Or you give them a second invisibility ring.
Yeah, if you wanted to do that as sort of more canon, you could do that during the earlier part of the Third Age. because Isildur gets it and then he loses it, and eventually Smeagol finds it. But there's a lot of time in between that. So
Sure.
yeah, I think like 2,500 years, something like that. So yeah, you could easily have that story. But then you're moving yourself further away from those touchstones I was talking about.
Yeah.
So then all you have is like Elrond, Galadriel, and Gandalf. Or whatever heir of Isildur is ruling during that time. So yeah, my thinking was that you want to focus on the rings of power as like the evil objects, the MacGuffins.
Sure.
And there's clear options for ones that exist, and you have to use a little bit of DM freedom to make that work. Like the rings aren't explicitly called out as being on the Wraith's fingers, but I mean they probably still are there.
I mean, you could get the dwarven rings or something. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, but then Tolkien's canon is that the dwarven kings have them, and they're just not doing anything with them because the rings corrupt them and make it so they don't want to do anything.
Right. That'd work.
Yeah. What type of system do you think you would use for?
I think you use D&D. I think you use D&D, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean that's the obvious choice because D&D is almost designed with Lord of the Rings in mind.
That's what it's for. Basically, you play like you don't like people to get too high level. Basically, you like it. I don't know. Like there's a whole class based on Aragorn. I don't know what you want me to tell you.
Well, so there was a Lord of the Rings system that was made.
More than one, I believe.
Yeah. There was one that was made in response to the movies coming out, I suppose I should say. And I've played it, and it's got some balance issues. And
not is actual Lord of the Rings. I'm sorry.
Well, okay, so I mean, this is true for every system that tries to blend like narrative stuff and combat stuff while still keeping it like a fairly crunchy system. Where so you can focus on someone who's like good at cooking and finding tracks and making your way through a thick forest or something like that. Or you can make a guy that can swing a sword really quickly and hit a bunch of times on your turn.
Right.
And it's got this issue where like, their skill set doesn't really overlap. So whenever there's a bunch of orcs that attack, Merry and Pippin just fucking run away because they're useless.
Right.
And then Aragorn, Gimli, and Legolas show up and do all the fighting. But, if you want to talk to the Ents and tell them what to do, Gimli is, again, fucking useless because he's got his axe up and the trees don't trust him with the axe.
Right.
So that's a big weakness in the official Lord of the Rings system that was designed, 20 years ago.
Sure.
Is that you end up with having to make those kind of choices for your characters. And I think it gets lessened later on, like when you're not just having a sort of it doesn't use levels, but let's just say first level character. Because then you're able to get more of those like additional skills. So you don't have someone who's just a fighter. Which is also why Legolas is the best party member because he's the oldest, so he has the most skills.
I don't know that.
Well, also because elves are just broken.
Yeah, I mean, part of that is like I say, I mean, you can blame the rule system, but it's like God, it's how the world was. Like that's how Tolkien wrote it.
Yeah. I mean, like so.
I just don't know if that.
Yeah, like like D&D tries to make the races fairly balanced. I would say humans are a little bit better because you get more freedom of choice, but they're mostly balanced.
Yeah.
Official Lord of the Rings setting? Absolutely not. Play an elf. The reason to not play an elf is because you want to have a story reason not to. Yeah. Or if you're going to be a ring bearer, then you should be a hobbit because they have some resistance to the One Ring.
This is the sort of problem with the Lord of the Rings. It just isn't like it's just not balanced.
Yeah,
and it's not. And if you're unbalanced, the level you miss. I think your best bet is you're I don't know, you're all humans and in the third age between the Hobbit and fellowship, then you can have a balanced party. But fundamentally, like, it's just not balanced.
I mean, you can make
the elves are better. The humans who are nobles are better. Like, it is what it is.
Well, you can make a dwarf and a human that are about. You can imagine them being about the same capability.
Who?
Dwarves and humans.
Sure.
And for an elf that's actually like the same capability as humans and dwarves, I think you kind of have to imagine them being a very weak elf, or the humans and dwarves being very strong for it to still match with what the setting material is telling you. Or you can just kind of suspend your disbelief a little bit and roll with it.
Yeah, I mean, those are definitely all options.
Or you use a more narrative story. So Dungeon World, like
yeah,
Legolas basically never misses an orc with his arrows when he's shooting his bow. And Dungeon World works pretty well for that because, you have the critical success where like he kills a bunch of orcs, or the non-critical success where he kills a few orcs but then more show up.
Yeah.
So then he's still hitting every arrow he fires is a hit, but it just has less narrative significance. So he can still feel really cool even though the effect on the situation is lessened because of the way the system works.
That's I think probably the right way to do it. Although it's tricky because a lot of times you're trying to build a story in Dungeon World, but you're not going to build a better story than Lord of the Rings. So I don't know what you're doing at some level.
Well, I mean, Lord of the Rings is a good story for reading, but that's not
right.
That's not what we're doing. So,
yeah, that makes sense.
No, I think we talked about the stuff I wanted to talk about for the setting mostly. Did you have anything you wanted to cover?
Yeah, I was just gonna say one thing that struck me rereading it is like it's like the only it's like one of the very few fictional things that pretty clearly represents World War One, with both with Mordor sort of being the Somme, and then I think the Dead Marshes being Third Ypres or Passchendaele. And it's just like it was just impressive. That's really all I want to bring up. So if you want to do that, if for some reason you want to do like a World War One reference, then maybe you can draw something from Lord of the Rings, because it's obviously very hard to reference World War One, because nothing happens. I mean, that's exaggeration, but if you're talking about the battles, usually a bunch of people die and nothing happens. So,
no, I definitely agree with that. When you mentioned the Third Ypres,
it's better known as Passchendaele. That's probably what Tolkien was
Passchendaele. And I looked at like the pictures of the battlefield afterwards, and it's like, oh yeah, that's definitely the Dead Marshes.
Yeah, it is.
And even the like, if for Tolkien's like version of that, that's where there was a big battle, and there's a bunch of like ghosts in the marsh.
Right.
So yeah, that's very much like seems inspired by that. He wasn't at that battle, but I'm sure he knew people that were.
Yeah, well, it was like I believe it was the bloodiest battle of the war for the British, not for. It wasn't the bloodiest, obviously, but
yeah, I looked at the casualty numbers, and the British, 1 in 3 of them died.
Yeah, not great.
Yeah, that would be 1 in 3 of the British that participated in that battle were killed by it. And they won. Wow, what a great Pyrrhic victory.
Yeah. It's well, I mean, uh, at some level, like you're just trying to, like, they lost about the same number as the Germans, and they had more. So, like, in a sense, like it wasn't a Pyrrhic victory. Like they could afford to keep winning those battles.
Yeah,
Winning those
I mean,
battles, like it's just like sort of sad. Like
yes, World War One was definitely not as much a test of like your ability to win battles, but your ability to keep your population motivated to continue the war.
they, I mean, well, Russia failed on that front, but
Oh yeah,
um, mostly the other countries and empires and whatnot didn't. Just like just kind of ran out of guys. Like it's. I think the French
yeah,
suffered the worst, but like,
yeah. The Germans at the end of the war were recruiting 13-year-olds.
yeah, and then they ran it back in World War Two.
Yeah, and this is after like what 4 years of war as well. So these are kids that would have been 9 when the war started, or 8.
Yeah, I mean that's why they that's why they surrendered.
Yeah, yeah.
um,
But yes, it is. It is interesting with how much death happened in the World Wars to look at like sort of the population effects afterwards. For like, yeah, you look at the population of Germany, and it's still having echoes of the amount of death that occurred during World War One.
yeah, I mean and again, I believe France suffered even a higher proportion of because they lost 1.4 million, and I think I'm not sure what the population of France was at the time, but I think it was higher than that was more than for Germany.
I just looked it up. So yeah, 1.6 million dead.
Yeah,
6 million casualties, which represented 71% of the combatants.
yes.
Whew.
Yeah, I mean it's their population was about 40 million in 1914, which so basically they lost like
Okay, so they basically drafted everyone that was of eligible age and
right.
had a 70% casualty rate.
Right. And you still see the population. I don't know how much you see them now, but even in going into World War II, like obviously, because those are sort of the people that would have been having children, but they were dead.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, it's interesting that I think the wounded casualty rate is probably higher for that as well because of the different types of weapons that were used.
yeah.
We're getting a little bit of a tangent here. How do we bring it back to Tolkien?
What I'm saying is that if you want to represent,
we want to bring in some
mustard.
We want to bring in some mustard gas into our
right. What I'm saying is you want to represent Passchendaele in fiction. The Dead Marsh is a good place to start.
I think using like some sort of malevolent gas is not a bad idea for like you were talking about weakening Mordor. So maybe Mordor has some sort of gas weapon that the party has to take away and defeat. Right? Like the orcs are immune to it because they're ugly monsters, but humans are hacking and dying. So you have to like develop some sort of antidote for it so you can get into like the production factory and destroy it. And along the way, like Gandalf is helping you because that's Gandalf's job. And like you have to sneak through Shelob's lair to get into Mordor to destroy the factory, and that's a campaign idea right there.
Yeah, there you go. There's your campaign. You're trying to shut down Shelob's factory. No, shut down Sauron's factory.
Yeah, maybe the mustard gas is made from Shelob's farts. Who knows?
We don't know. That's your decision as a DM.
Yeah. Just stop feeding her orcs and she stops farting. They're very, very gassy.
Oh God, is this the plot of this campaign that we kidnap hobbits and feed them to Shelob? This has gone real dark, real fast.
I won't say no. Got to give her something tasty that's better than an orc, but doesn't give her gas.
So, anyway, that's just one of the great campaign ideas you can get from setting the stage.
Oh man, yeah. Anything else you wanna talk about?
Not really.
Okay, yeah. Let me think. There was another idea I had. Is that there's in Tolkien's writing he had 5 wizards. So we know like Gandalf and Saruman from the books, and Radagast shows up in the Hobbit movies and in the Silmarillion. But there's these 2 other wizards, the blue wizards, that just sort of screw off, and Tolkien never wrote what they were doing. So that's another area where you can have like characters that are like Gandalf, but a DM could have more like freedom in what they're writing.
Sure.
Says Tolkien's writing is all about the lands of the West: Gondor, Rohan, Hobbitland, Mirkwood. But if you look at the map, like that's not just sea on the eastern part. There's other stuff in that direction.
Sure. And you can maybe it's the Hobbit. It's the Great Hobbit Empire. Who knows?
Yeah. Or it could be rat people or whatever. I mean, you can bring in. Yeah, you could bring in other races from D&D. Like I don't know if you want to bring in rat people, but you could bring in like
tieflings or whatever.
Yeah, tieflings. Yeah, they're popular. So yeah, you can bring in some tieflings. They're like orcs that became good or something. I don't know. You can work it out, and you can have like a whole nation of those people over there, and the 2 wizards are over there doing something about it.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, yeah, I think I'm talked on it for now. So you wanna call here?
Absolutely. Thank you for inviting me on the inaugural podcast.
All right. Cool. Thanks for coming.